Thanks for coming. I was talking to Robin and Jim right here, who were just mentioned, City of Edmonton, and we were talking about what we read. And Robin was saying, well, she doesn't read nonfiction so much because she gets an onslaught of information every day in her work. And I really identify with that, and so do I. And I think it's very difficult in the field we are in. I think all of us are in some related field to the environment, to climate, to social justice, and to all the different aspects of that, that we're just surfeited with information. And it's easy to think that information is knowledge. And it's not, of course. There's nothing related at all. They're not related at all. You can't be knowledgeable without a basis of information, but the amount of information that comes at us is extraordinary. And so what I have to do and what I want to share tonight is really comes from having to every so often sort of wipe the whiteboard clean and just say, wipe it out. And say, look, I don't know anything, as opposed to I know a lot and I want to share it with you. So what I have to do sometimes is literally just start over and say, what do I know? And when I do that, I try to ask myself questions which may seem stupid or even elementary, but I find them very helpful. And I think, like, sometimes stupid questions are extraordinary. Buckminster Fuller, when he was an ensign in the Navy, wanted to know why bubbles were round. And of course, for us, that's a tautology. Well, a bubble is round, and the same thing. From him, it was not true. Why not triangular? Why not, octagon? Why round? And out of that came tensegrity and the geodesic dome, and so many things that he was known for came from asking that question as a board ensign in the Navy looking at the wake of the ship. And I can give you many other examples of famous inventors who asked basically simple questions. I will not be famous for this question, I can assure you. But my question to myself is this, which is, how big are we? Because what you hear about in terms of climate change is like there's too many people doing terrible things, and we're losing the ship. We're losing the Earth. We're going to lose climatic stability, and there's a huge threat to civilization. And I don't, in a sense, question those conclusions so much as I wanted to know, how big are we? And what I mean by big is I don't mean how many. How many is nearly 7.1 billion people. And I would just propose to you that has no meaning to any of us. What do you have a billion of? What did you count a billion of? What does a billion mean to you? It has no meaning to us. It's just an abstraction. But big we can see, we can feel, size, scale, so forth. So my question to myself is, this is a sphere, and the question is, if we were a sphere, if you put all humanity together in a big giant cuddle, what would our biomass be if it was a sphere? In other words, how big are we on this beautiful spaceship going through Earth? You want to think about it for a minute? I know it's kind of an odd question, but what would be the diameter? You can yell out an answer, it's fine. Huh? 1 kilometer? 1 kilometer? Any other? Less than Alberta. I've had Texas as a guess, by the way. It was a Texan who guessed that. 100 kilometers. Any other guesses? And again, it's us, no water, no dehydration. It's us, it's a full body mass, but there's no air between us. So here's Edmonton, and there it is. You can see it there, actually, but it's hard to see. So let's go in closer, and here it is. There it is. That's all of humanity. And it's so interesting. You're great. You're a great audience. The guess was right, by the way. It's 883 meters. It's not even a kilometer. And when I was doing this for the Society of Ecological Restoration in Madison last month, 1,200 scientists, and before I even got through, I mean, I didn't get this far, and people said, no, not true, and And the reason I show this to you is because we all have frames. We have ways of seeing the world that we know are right. We know them so well that we don't even think about it, and we jump to a conclusion. That's called a frame, right? And in the case of this, I did this at Pratt Whitney in Connecticut, and it showed this sphere over the Pratt Whitney factory, and it fit inside the factory walls. And afterwards, an engineer came up to me and said, you know, loved your presentation, I loved your graphics, and he put his hand on my shoulder and said, too bad you got the math wrong, though, you know. And I said, did you do the math? And he said, no. I said, okay, just asking. So I want to suggest to you that there's other things, that there just could be other things that we hold in our mind as being so, that may not be so. And this is especially important when we think about climate and climate change and the predictions about the future. And this other sphere here is the carbon that's emitted every year. And when I showed this in Toronto to business executives who are very literate about the environment this year, they thought that was the carbon emissions of Toronto. And I said, no, it's not. And they said, oh, you mean Canada? I said, no, for the whole world. Okay, that's our carbon emissions. So there's humanity, there's our carbon emissions. And what I asked them, because business has a very strong bias for action, is, does this look doable to you? Because it does to me, and I just want to know if it, and they said, yeah, this looks doable. When you think half of that is actually already being sequestered by the oceans and by the land, right? So only half of that sphere is actually going up into the upper atmosphere, about 18 billion tons of carbon, right? So, yeah. And they hadn't looked at it this way, and I'm not saying it's easy to do by any stretch of the imagination, but what I am saying is that when you look at it this way, it looks very different than when you abstract it. You know, so many billion people, so many billion tons, and so many coal plants, and there's so many. And when you look at it this way, you realize that, in fact, humanity is just a speck on the earth. Just a speck. Altogether, we're a speck, you know. Separately, we're really a speck. And there we go. Gone. Bye. Okay. So what I'm saying here is, though, what's a takeaway? This speck does so much. It's amazing. It's hard for us to understand the value of small things or the impact of small things. And if I was to have a little sort of 14-inch yoga ball right here like this, or whatever that ball would be, that would be all of the estrogen or the estradiol in the world. And believe me, it runs the world. It's in men too, you know. Yeah. So that is all the hormones that runs 400 activities in the human body and influences them. And it just fit like this, right? So in the same way, though, the population doesn't understand what a big influence carbon dioxide has. You know, because it seems so small, so inconsequential. What are we talking about here? You see it that way, you think, how could that have such a big effect? And how sensitive this spaceship is, how sensitive the Earth is, how sensitive we are. It's only gone up in the last 100 years about 2 to 3 watts per square meter, the heat. That's nothing. 2 to 3 watts? Nothing. It's a huge amount of energy that's changed the flux on Earth. And so I want to show this in terms of who we are. So we may be a speck, but this is the Pinheiros River in Sao Paulo. This is a really beautiful river, actually. But as you can see, this is what humankind does. You know? And this is the rim fire. It's we think it's the biggest fire in California history. Can you relate it to climate change? No, you can't. Not really. Correlation is not causation, but it's still our biggest fire in history. And this is actually a traffic jam that's still going on. It's in China. You see 24 of the lanes there. There's more lanes underneath. It's 100 miles long. It's been going on for over a month. goes from a city 100 miles from Shanghai to Shanghai. They're doing some construction somewhere. There's a whole set of vendors that have set up for miles and miles along the roadway selling noodles and things that you need when it takes 4 days to get from the city to Shanghai by car, right? 4 days. And you think, okay, this is really brilliant. And so the specs are doing things like this is Calgary, and it's not Calgary, it's Boulder, it's Typhoon Haiyan now. It's so many places in the world where you get this extraordinary change in the intensity of weather or intensity of rainfall, which just absolutely destroys what we thought was the norm. This you know well, it's here. There's the tar sands. This is what we think is a good idea to get energy. Not so good. This is what happens when birds interact with the way we get energy. And this is what happens to birds in Midway Island. This is Chris Jordan's work. You may know Chris. Midway is the midway between, Asian continent and North America. That's why it's called Midway. It's to the west of the Hawaiian Islands. And this is what the albatross look like when they die, because they're so full of plastic, both the young ones and the mature adults. They die earlier than they should, and they die full of detritus from plastic that is floated there not from that island, but from both continents, primarily from Asia. So even though we're a speck, we have an enormous impact. And what's happened especially with Typhoon Haiyan, which is arguably the largest storm in history, human history, that we know of. Maybe we're wrong, but certainly it's been argued that, is that we now know that climate disruption is not a prediction. We don't have to worry about that anymore. It's here. So, in other words, we'll put that one aside. It's not something that's going to come to a neighborhood near you. It's here. And what it means is that we live in one habitat. We think we live in different habitats, but now, the Earth has become one place, really, in the view of climate change. It's one world that we live in. And either we unite or we're going to be forced to unite in some way, because we are no longer, in a sense, ghettoized or siloed into different places and citizenry and nationalities, because climate change knows nothing about that. One of the tyrannies of climate change, however, is that it's presented on such a vast scale and such a magnitude that I think it makes us feel small. And there's such great vistas of doom now that are being presented to us, by great writers, and there's a whole cottage industry about forecasting, and people compete to see if they have even a better story of how bad it's going to be in the future, what's going to go wrong. And I would just say that that's not very helpful. It may be based on good science. I think it is, very good science, but it's not helpful to us as human beings. And sustainability itself has been marked in its relatively short life by incremental improvements and fixes and so forth. We're just sort of still getting our arms around what that means, because it really is about systems thinking, and systems thinking doesn't lend itself well to the way we normally think, which is to optimize components in a system. And the system we have is a result of that type of thinking, and systemic thinking is very different. George Bush, W. Bush, at the Earth Summit in Rio 20-some years ago, said that the American way of life is not up for negotiation. It's a famous phrase. And he's absolutely right, and that's because nature doesn't negotiate. He had it upside down. It certainly isn't up for negotiation. And as you can see in Calgary, you can see in the Philippines, it's non-negotiable. And nature expresses it does not negotiate with us at all. Now you see in industry, you have a vice president of sustainability for Monsanto. You have one for DuPont, who used to be the vice president of sustainability for Monsanto. Now she's at DuPont. You have one for Dow Chemical. You have people saying that if you don't support GMOs and nuclear power, you're not an environmentalist and you want to see children starve and freeze. But this way of thinking about the environment really comes from a key assumption. And the belief is that you can fix civilization by optimizing, as I said, the components, that the world is mechanistic in its functions, that it's made of parts and pieces, that dirt is a medium, that buildings are housing, that people are collateral, especially when drones are flying overhead from the United States, that cities are population centers. The capitalism needs some new parts and pieces and some new chemicals and some patented germplasm and cadmium-coated solar panels and cars with 200 million lines of code. And an internet, which if at night, you sort of do a search for, black fishnet stockings, the next morning on your Yahoo page, there's an advertisement for them. It's like, I found that so embarrassing. Anyway, what we need to do is change how we see the world. That comes first. Because how we see the world is reflected in how we think we're going to even fix the world. And how we change the world is going to come from how we see ourselves. And then how we see ourselves is how we see each other. So this is about sort of looking at climate change and the solutions to it a little bit differently. First, I want to resurrect the word carbon. Carbon has become a term of derision, of demonization, carbon pollution, carbon footprint, carbon this, carbon that. Somehow carbon is a bad thing. It is not a bad thing. It is an extraordinary thing. Carbon is not just the basis of life. We have, you remember from high school, and we have this sense of the carbon cycle, or this circle going from the ocean to the atmosphere and from the land and forest to the atmosphere. And that picture of carbon would be like saying human history is men and women get together, make love, have children, and die, which is true. But it's not human history. And that picture of carbon is so cartoonish and ridiculous that it really just eviscerates the concept of the intricacy and the beauty of carbon itself. And so I'm writing a book called Carbon, the Business of Life. And the first line of that is carbon is the element that holds hands and collaborates. It is, besides oxygen, the friendliest atom you could possibly imagine. It loves to combine, do things, work with other molecules, and make things all by itself. No help from industry, right? It's in the vast majority of all compounds on Earth. I remember doing a climate ride, and we were coming down into San Francisco, and I was going to speak at City Hall, and then the whole group of several hundred bikers broke into a chant, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da, we are carbon-free, da-da-da-da-da-da, we are carbon-free, and I'm going, I hope not. And I was like, we had just stopped at the Presidio, had coffee and bagels, carbohydrates, and then we're all on carbon-frame bicycles, and we're pedaling, which means the sugar is working, and but there's this idea somehow the carbon is over there, we got to get rid of it. And carbon is the answer to our nightmare, not our nightmare. Combustion of hydrocarbons, now that's a problem for sure. And the way we use our land, or misuse our land, or abuse our land, that is definitely a problem. But in a sense, what I want to circle back on is that we become very good at imagining the end of the world, but not very good at imagining the beginning of the world. And what's become unimaginable, what is unimaginable one time is the loss of civilization, what's happening. What's become unimaginable now is the belief that we are intelligent, problem-solving animals, and that we're brilliant and we're extraordinary. And that we are going to do something about this, and that we are right now. And one of the things I spoke about earlier today in this workshop with David Kahane was really this, we conflate two things. We see the inertia and the momentum of the damage that's occurring. But the momentum goes back decades and centuries. It goes back a long, long time to the very beginning of the Industrial Age and even before that. Shell oil is hundreds of years old, It didn't start 10 years ago. And this wanton use of carbon fuels to fuel everything we do was a great blessing in many, many ways, and now it's a curse. but it has tremendous inertia. The movement to address the salient issues of our time, including probably the most important one, which is global climate change, climate disruption, is new. It's very new. It's very nascent. It's still finding its way. And what's happening is you get what I call the narcissism of failure. You get people saying, oh my God, this is happening, this is happening, this is happening, this is happening, this is, all the bad things are happening. We're failing, 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 failing. So therefore, we are failing. And I'm saying, don't conflate what you're doing, the small, extraordinary movements in humanity towards changing how we inhabit this earth and how we relate to each other, with the inertia and the momentum of the past. That is not a failure. We are not failing. And the analogy I give here is the human immune system. And the immune system can only come into play when there's something to do. If there is something that comes in that's a not you, that's tagged antigenically, then the immune system can come into it its own. Right? So it follows. There's a lag time. We know that. But what we know about the immune system is that the better, the more connected it is to itself, the more powerful immune system you have. And this movement, whatever you want to call it, that I wrote about in Blessed Rest, that we all know about and all are part of, is connecting more and more of it to itself, all around, in cities, in regions, in states, in countries, and globally. And as it does so, it becomes a much more powerful movement. And I ask you this, which is, where is your immune system? Where? Find it. You can't find it. So we have this idea that somehow, if there's going to be serious change on the planet, there should be some centrality to it. There should be some big organization. Somebody should be ahead of it. There should be a charismatic white male vertebrate saying really clever things. But actually, thank God there's not a white charismatic male vertebrate at the head of this movement. Right? This is a very, very different regime that we're going into. And we have to be sure that we don't look for love in the wrong places. And love in the wrong places in my country is called Washington, D.C., okay? Stop already. Forget about it. It's gone. It's corrupt. 90% of the nations on earth are completely corrupted by corporations. Whether you're polite about it or impolite, whether it's brazen or whether it's subtle, they're corrupted. It's not the vector of change. As I said in the beginning, change comes from small things, and grows. It doesn't come from big things and on the top down. And one of the extraordinary changes that's happening, this little comment about in terms of climate change, is what's called the peer-to-peer or the sharing economy. And I think it's treated really still rather frivolously by the press and by people who think it's a business opportunity. But the fact is that a whole generation is looking at their parents, looking perhaps at the other peers and saying, God, I don't think I want to work my buns off for 40 years to get enough money to pay off my house and have a car and maybe a vacation home and then not have much of a life left over. I think I'm going to start living my life right now. And to do that, I'm going to not have as much stuff. I'm going to work with my peers in a way that I'll Airbnb, I'll share houses, I will share things, I'll have neighbor goods, I'll do zip cars, I will basically have less stuff in order to have more experience. Because I'm here to live. And so that is the core of the sharing economy. And it's brilliant. And what I'm saying is the sharing economy is going to be bigger than the internet. It depends on the internet. The internet started as science, moved quickly to pornography, and then to advertising. Right? And so now everything you do basically is about somebody figuring out, whether it's an app or whether it's social media, figuring out who you are so they can advertise to you. And this is the period, this is the dopamine period of the internet, okay, where everybody's getting their dopamine, and so are the advertisers. But we're going to really the highest and best use of the internet, which is to build complex networks of sharing, and they're based on trust. They're based on trust. you know. And this is the world knitting itself together in an entirely new way. I mean, I could just read names to you, the companies that are starting and the ways they're doing it. My daughter has, she has 1/12 of a cow at the farm in Oregon. She owns 1/12 of a cow. She gets a gallon of milk every 2 days, you know. I mean, I didn't know there was cow share, but there is cow share. I always thought it was cow share. And it's just spreading like crazy. And so the footprint of humanity is dropping. People who use car-to-go or Zipcar and so forth, they use 1/10 less automobiles than when people own them together. I mean, own them separately. The average power drill in the United States is used for 11 minutes its whole life. 11 minutes, that's it. You know, do you have one? So what we want to talk about is this. And this is the book, Carbon, The Business of Life. And what this book is about, it has no shame, blame, guilt, or shoulds or oughts or ought-nots in it. It doesn't whistle past the graveyard of the science about climate change. Its purpose is to reacquaint us with something that is so precious, beautiful, mysterious, and enchanting, and to fall in love with life. That's what this book's about. And because we can't heal something if we think it's our enemy. And carbon is our ally. And so what you see there is, if you can read it, it's a book about, not so well, but a book about princes, frogs, fullerenes, fusion, fungus, biophony, beetles, voyages, stiction, fiction, drawdown, chirps, meshing, plasma, princesses, carbon seeds, highlines, sugars, anthromes, rewilding, resonance, and earthlings, and then in parentheses there it's in the future of civilization, and with a little smiley face. And there's 2 books I want to talk about tonight. This is one of them, and the reason I'm writing this is because I feel like we've lost our way with respect to understanding life. And we see life as other. And if you look at the world through the lens of carbon, it is a very extraordinary place. And so I'm trying to do that. There's 82 stories of carbon here. These are carbon stories. Nobody's ever written carbon stories before that I know of. And this is Princes and Princesses, so I wasn't kidding about frogs and princes. But these aren't the frogs. These are the princes. And they're the crown princes of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Frederick and Victoria, and Hawken is his name, actually, from Norway. And they and 3 other scientists and myself went to northern Greenland to go to the North-Indian Ice Research Station, which was, at that time, and now it's completed it, drilling 2 miles down into the ice core to go to the last interglacial period, which is the Eemian period 125,000 years ago. It's an interesting time because at that time, hippopotamus were lounging in the Thames estuary. You know, giraffes and lions were pouncing across Germany. Alligators were doing their thing up in near Vancouver. And it was a very different regime. There was 300 parts per million, not quite, instead of 400. It was, obviously a very warm period. And this is how you make a mobile call in Greenland. You get very close to the person you're calling. And this is how you get there. And the U.S. National Guard, the Schenectady National Guard, supplies these planes and ferries people back and forth. This is where you go, and this is what it looks like when you get there. You have a geodesic dome, and then you have a container for the diesel. You have basically tents where you live. You can go there for 3 months of the year. And anytime I think of, when I read stuff about that denigrates the integrity of climate scientists, it just sort of, I get my back up when I think of these people here. They're there for 90 days. We were there 2 weeks after the go-to guy who was the one who oriented you to how to survive in that environment. Basically lost both arms because he got caught out in a whiteout and wasn't found for a day. And so he's a double amputee. And these people, they are at risk. And they are there from 14 countries. You saw the flags. And this is a nice day. This is a really nice day in July. And I mean, you can get out and get a suntan. I mean, and this is what it's all about, is this ice cave. And this, in there is all the equipment, the drills, the labs, the monitors, the storage facilities, and it's extraordinary. It's cold in there too, but not quite as cold as it is outside. And I just want to give you a sense of the flavor of what people are doing. The IPCC report, at the last report, not the fifth one, but the fourth one, had 1.5 billion data points supporting the science, you know. And one of the things about this is when you look at the ice cores coming up, they come from way down, they're coming up. They use coconut milk for lubrication. It doesn't mess up the data. Oil or petroleum would. And so when it comes up, it's steaming. You see this steaming white milk bubbling up from deep underneath. And it looks like a kind of a B movie, you know, from Hollywood, you know, like it came from the deep or something, you know. And that's what it's like to be there. It is just, you just freeze all the time. It makes Edmonton look like Miami, really. And they're just doing extraordinary work. And when they have an ice core, they can run an anode cathode readout. They can read it out and show the readout and say, okay, there was a bihemispheric volcano in around the 1360s. How do we know it's bihemispheric? Because we match our data with our colleagues in Antarctica. I mean, there's this extraordinary network of scientists around the world who are doing amazing, amazing work. And this I want to show you. This is about discovery a friend of mine named Bernie Krause, who co-started the field of acoustic ecology. And we know that in a forest, in an ecosystem, in a wetland, that when it's intact, that all the nutrient niches are occupied by different critters or detritivores or, you know, worms or birds or whatever. And that there's an extraordinarily efficient an exchange of nutrients in an intact ecosystem. What he discovered and others discovered is that what all these creatures do is something else, which is so surprising. They occupy all the acoustic niches as well. Like, why? It's as if they were forming an orchestra. Like, you be the oboe, you're the timpani, you're the clarinet, you're going to, I mean, and they do. And Bernie discovered this by accident because he's just recording sounds in nature. And you go to the wildest places because they're the best sounds. And he was selling them, and, you know. And then he started looking at sound prints. He started looking at the printouts and going, wait a minute, there isn't any place for a new creature to come in and make a sound. It's occupied. And then he went to places that had been logged or you know, damage had occurred, or a bridge had gone in over a wetland. And all of a sudden, the bullfrog, you know, which occupied that Hertz range, all of a sudden had competition. A Peterbilt truck. Boom, 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 boom. And the bullfrog, all of a sudden, like I said, couldn't communicate well. But what he discovered, and what they've discovered, is that you think the species are communicating to each other. They are. It's not all about mating. It is not. That's us projecting on them. They don't project that on us, that every time we say something, we're trying to mate, you know? But we project that on creatures and birds. But they're listening to each other. That is what the other creatures, you know, say, enunciate, sing, croak, growl, chirp, actually means something interspecies-wise as well. So what happens is when you get anthrophony, when you get human sound into an intact ecosystem, it goes into perturbation. That one species that you're occupying might be the one that goes into perturbation. When it goes into perturbation, the whole ecosystem goes into perturbation. And you get a collapse of life, and you get a collapse of sound. And Bernie went to one place, Lincoln Meadows in Sierra Nevada, intact, beautiful, virgin, a very sensitive logging company went in, says, we're going to log this, we use the best methods, we use helicopters, this, that, we won't destroy it, not building roads. They went in, he went in 9 years later, there's absolutely no comparison. It never recovered in terms of this, you know, and it never recovered. You compare the sound originally and the sound later, never came back. So this is also carbon, because when you have an intact ecosystem, it actually sequesters the optimum amount of carbon, because it's life. That's what life does. It holds carbon. It's a carbon-based life form. So even when sound goes into a wild place, carbon is released into the atmosphere. And I'm not saying this to blame or saying we shouldn't develop. I'm just saying isn't this exquisite? The relationship between different species and ourselves and carbon and I mean, it's just extraordinary, the sensitivity. And what we also learn from this, which we'll learn for the next one, is about sharing. And we see the rise of the sharing economy. This is a tree. It happens to be on my farm where my daughter owns a 12-head cow. But this is called the mother tree, and this is the crown of the tree. And Dr. Suzanne Simard, who some of you must know, she's at UBC and has done extraordinary work with her students in terms of trying to figure out what's going on in the forests. And for most of the 20th century, the science of forests and vegetative communities was that plants compete for light, nutrients, and water. They're out there like, hey, and may the best plant or the best tree win. And so we would look at trees, and one's taller, one's shorter, and going, okay, that's evolution, and that's Darwinian evolution in, plain sight. Well, what Dr. Simard did is basically look at vegetative communities in a very, very different way. And again, if you saw plants together as communities, for most of the 20th century, you were sort of drummed out of the botany corps. You were like, come on, they're individuals. These plants are individuals. They're acting like individuals, just like we do in business and the economy and civilization, right? And what she did is she injected carbon-14 into these mother trees, these large, large trees, and then began to trace it. And she would trace it to saplings that are hundreds and hundreds of feet away, hundreds of yards away, very rapidly. And there's these huge mycorrhizal fungal networks underneath the forest, underneath our farms, if they're farmed correctly, but most of those are gone, in the soil, that act as these exquisite networks, transferring information, water, and nutrients to other plants, not only of the same species of fir, but also other species, not only the trees, but the shrubs. If one tree is in a sere, dry area, and it's in a wet area, it'll donate its water to that tree. Why? Why? And, Dr. Simard said the tree is acting altruistically. She said it's acting, they call it a mother tree. She's a mother, she should know what a mother does. Her men colleagues didn't like that one bit. And because there's still this vestigial idea that somehow the plants are individuals, when in fact what we now know is that this is an extraordinarily complex community where there's mutualism, tremendous amount of mutualism and sharing. And we can project on anything we think we want to project on in terms of why it does so, for survival, all that sort of stuff. But what we know is that whether it's in biophony or whether it's here, is that the world that we see, the world we live in, the world we come from, the world we derive our poetry and our food and our nutrients and our inspiration from acts very differently than we've been acting. And that's the most important thing. And our model, our paradigm of what business should be, what governance is, what nations should do and not do, is really anachronistic, truly broken, truly incorrect, truly not helpful, truly causative of the problems we face as opposed to curative. And that's what the forest has to tell us. Now, when we go back to climate change, and I know this is a quick shift, this is a way we often present information to people. And if you're a geek, and I think many of you are, I recognize you, I'm one, I love information like this. I can stare at it and go, wow, a person really got it together. And, but this isn't really helpful to the population as a whole, is what I'm saying. It doesn't really win the day. And if this is good compared to this one, this is the National Geographic, which normally you associate with extraordinary graphics and good infographics, good presentation. This is, yeah, people are looking at it like, what is that? It's the so-called stabilization wedges of the Carbon Mitigation Project from Princeton University, from Sokolow and Pakala. And it was printed in 2001, or the first wedges were published, then. And it was the academic response to climate change, what we should do, right? And this is the National Geographic trying to make it accessible to its readers. And the whole idea of a wedge, I mean, think about it. Like, why a wedge? Because it comes from all these straight lines, and if you do straight lines in a world, nature has no straight lines, by the way. If you do straight lines, you come up with wedges, and you come up with this abstraction. These are the mitigation measures. These are the stabilization wedges. This is what we have to do in order to stabilize carbon at 550 ppm, all right? Now, at 550 ppm, nothing is stable, I can assure you that. So it's kind of an odd thing to call it stabilization. But notice what the color coding, I did this. Everything that's in purple is only something a utility can do, or a large energy company. You and I can't do anything about it, nothing. Not only that, some of the things in purple are things that no one's ever done before, like hydrogen fuel from coal with carbon capture systems, CCS. Nobody's ever done it. Nobody's doing it. I don't know if anybody's trying to do it out of a lab, but could be. So here is a proposal from Princeton about how to stabilize climate. And what happens is when people see this, when they read it, they just get more depressed. Like, oh my God, we really are in trouble. Because there's no agency here. What can you do about this? The pink or red ones, those are things that only big companies can do, car companies or appliance companies. So what's left is those green ones. You can do some of these. Soil storage, notice this is no bare fallow, cover crops, reducing aeration. Actually, we put that into place during the Dust Bowl in the United States in the 30s. So this is not very innovative. And there's extraordinary things we can do with soil right now. And solar electricity, we can put on our houses, but most of this is utility, so that's why I put half. And reduce miles traveled, we can do that for sure. So those are things we can do. And what's left out is so many different ways of addressing climate change. And what I'm saying is the way we're talking about it, the way we're presenting it, is really numbing us and making us feel like we don't have agency, we don't have power, we don't have something we can do constructive. Of course we can drive a hybrid car, of course we can put solar panels on our house, of course we can bring our own cup to Starbucks, but we have a sense that it's not going to do it, not win the day, and you're quite right, it will not. So what we're doing is we're gathering, and if somebody here at the university wants to be a part of it, it's great that myself and my colleagues are gathering together institutes, NGOs, academic departments, or trade associations, and we're making a book called Drawdown. And Drawdown is really comprised of pages just like this. Every page is a state-of-the-shelf social technology or state-of-the-shelf technology. In other words, it's being done, happened, measured, known. You can buy it. It's available. It's not gonna be, or I think it will, or maybe, it's happening, and it's already happened. And what we're saying is, and every spread is like the history, where did it come from, how does it work, when it was invented, 1872, when did we become interested that it emitted light, 1960, what happened between then and now, what is the cost, what is the efficiency, 10 times more efficient than an incandescent bulb. And then on every page, we organize this according to agency. And the agency is right here. And this is really, really important. And we start with individuals, what individuals can do. So those are the first 30, 40 pages. Then what neighborhoods and streets can do, what communities can do. And then what can facilities and buildings like this, what can they do? And then after that, what utilities and businesses can do. And then what happens after that is what cities and towns can do. And then after that is rural, what farms and forests and grassland managers can do. And then comes states, and then comes countries, and then comes global. So it's organized according to agencies. So if your dad is Jim, and you come home and he doesn't know anything about sustainability, okay, nothing at all. He was like, she does, she's come from school. And she says, Dad, here, I've marked this book, everything from this page back to individual, you have agency over. Because you're not really a city manager, but I kind of think, I'm going to make you city manager right now. And you have, so now he can then look at that and say, wow, okay, and the benchmark is what city's doing it. It's not just being done, but who's doing it and how and what are the resources? Where can you find out more about it, right? And so he can do that, and then he is got buildings and facilities, and he's a part of a neighborhood, he's an individual, etc. So he has agency all through those. The rest of it he doesn't, but he votes, just like the rest of us. And then on the bottom of it is probably the most, in some ways, the most important part, and it's the dashboard. And the dashboard starts with years to implement. How long would it take for us to implement LED lighting globally? Pants on fire, at least smoking, but really reasonably. Come on, it scales, it takes time, it's not going to happen overnight just because you want it to. So you have to come up with a reasonable figure, and you talk about your assumptions. So 15 years, what would be the first cost? And this, by the way, is a plug number. It's actually much, much higher than that. What would be the first cost? What would be the net cost in savings for that over a 30-year period? Would it cost us money, or will we save money? Save money in that case. Then every page, as you turn the page, has cumulative costs, cumulative savings, and then the right side of the page has the same thing for carbon. What would it mitigate in terms of carbon over 30 years? What would be the ppm reduction at the end of 30 years compared to what it would be otherwise? And then what would have been, actually the prediction is much higher in 30 years from now. We did this earlier, 500 and something. But what would be the cumulative ppm reduction at that part when you get to the book? So it's kind of like a flip book, like you can just see it, and you can just turn the pages, and what you start to see is that, that kind of Al Gore stepladder asymptote to hell, to Venus, you start to see it feather down. You start to slowly see it changing, and changing, slowly, page by page by page. And at one point, you hit stabilization. You hit a plateau where there's no change year to year. And the next year, you have a slight inflection down. That's drawdown. And there's no point in aiming for stabilization. None of us want stabilization. We want drawdown. We don't want to be where we stabilize. So that's why the book is called Drawdown. And so what we do know, by the way, we have done the numbers. I should get the new slide. Is the ppm reduction from LEDs alone in 2045 is over 8 ppm. Just from, remember, people say, oh, light bulbs, yeah, it doesn't do anything. Well, yeah, actually it does. It's extraordinary what light bulbs do. I was the one who used to say that, screwing in light bulbs, we have a big problem here. No, light bulbs make a huge difference. A huge difference. And this is like bike sharing programs. 500 cities in the world do it. The first 3 weeks in New York, 1 million miles were logged down the bicycles. So I don't know how much of that replaced car trips or taxi trips, but one of the interesting things about the bike sharing program in New York, it's made the city safer. Isn't that weird? In other words, there's less accidents, less pedestrian and car accidents, but the bikes on the road than without. Explain that one. I don't know. But what I'm saying is you can't be mad at people for not doing something they don't know about. And so until we actually have something, a manual, like a whole climate catalog, that really shows us what we know. This is not a proposal from myself and my colleagues. We're not proposing this. What we're saying is, this is what we know now. It's what we can do. And if we're going to affect climate change, we have to accept the idea that we don't know everything we need to do yet. We don't. But what we do know is extraordinary. And this is like half of the list. Now, the list is twice as big. of, of, of initiatives, of programs, of technologies that really are substantive in terms of their impact upon climate. And this is not, some of them you're familiar with, but this is not just the normal list you keep seeing all the time. This is a different list. And all these make a really, really significant impact. When you saw carbon, you saw fusion. There is, I mentioned today, a company in Irvine, California, in stealth for 13 years. They do fusion, which has been, nuclear fusion has been the hole in the ground you pour lots of government money and never see again. And it's privately held, privately financed, and they hit 5 milliseconds of ignition, which is the threshold for creating net energy in fusion. And they've hit it. And it's called Tri-Alpha Energy, and you'll see them come out this year. And they have the goal of replacing coal completely. And they're on it, and they're brilliant scientists from, I don't know how many languages are spoken there. Extraordinary. There is a new company in Silicon Valley that has reinvented the refrigeration cycle. They got rid of the compressor altogether. It's electronic. They reduce energy 70%, water 90%. As you know, the biggest draw, or may know, in the developing world is air conditioning on electricity, on coal-fired power plants. It's air conditioning. People don't want to boil and heat. Electrochromic glasses, glass, not glasses, but glass in buildings is coming, which is so sensitive to heat and light, and that we can reduce energy in buildings by an extraordinary amount. You have light bulbs now. Light bulbs exist. They have, each light bulb has an IP address. Each light bulb is going to the cloud. Each light bulb has sensors in it. It is like, you think the NSA is intrusive? No, I mean, it knows so much about what's going on in a building and can transmit it instantly to those who should know. Now, it has no photographic, so it can't take images of you. But it can tell what's going on in terms of heat and population and whether there's anybody in it, whether a fire is starting, whether there's smoke or, I mean, it's extraordinary. They're just going in everywhere. They have a huge impact in terms of building efficiency and building energy. I could just go on and on. These are not in drawdown, by the way, yet. But there is an extraordinary amount of people working on innovative solutions that really surpass anything that we thought could happen even 5, 10 years ago. Nobody thought that we would, invent a new refrigeration cycle. It goes back to Carrier standing there and looking at dew point, and that's how air conditioning was created, the refrigeration cycle. So what we're coming to is a world that is really sensate. In other words, where the connectivity is occurring between each other and between the things that we need to operate and run this world, so forth, are getting closer, and they're getting connected with the speed of light. And it's a time of great and greater feedback and intelligence. Sometimes it's intrusive, and we're seeing that, and that's not good. And it's hard to believe this when you look at national governments, but the vector of change isn't coming from there. It's coming from individuals, from entrepreneurs, from universities, it's coming from science, it's coming from so many different places. And the national governments are really an artifact of the 18th century. This is the 21st century, and the 21st century is being reinvented. And again, I just say, when you look at the newspaper, you look at the headlines, you look at news, it's just not reflecting the extraordinary brilliance and creativity of humanity at this time. And I want to sort of end with one more slide, which is another story, and this is the Amazon. And it's another carbon story. And this story is about in the Amazon, before 1492, there were large agricultural cities and civilizations inside the Amazon. And they got wiped out by disease and disappeared, and the forest went back. They used what's called terra preta, a kind of black soil. They somehow managed to take those thin, acidic soils and make them extraordinarily rich, extraordinarily fertile, and had agricultural civilizations there with cities. But what happened, of course, in 1492 and thereon was the introduction of European, Spanish, and Portuguese initially, but with disease. And disease wiped out 90% of the population in North and Meso and South America before a century had lapsed. And there was this huge collapse of the indigenous population. And what we have to understand is that in Meso and South America, but also North America too, but especially in Meso and South America, it was a huge agricultural civilization. Not maybe up there with India and China, but right up there. Certainly much, much, much more developed than Europe in every sense of the word. And it collapsed. And with that collapse, you had the sequestration of carbon. You went back to bamboo and forests, and actually carbon levels fell all during that century and the next century. And you got this cooling period in Europe, especially, and in North America. And temperatures went down and down. You began to get snow in the winters. You began to get winters, in summers, that looked like this. In other words, you had snow that actually never went off the ground for the whole summer in Nordic countries. And you had famine, and you had food shortages. And during the next century, there was a man born named Antonio Stradivari in Cremona, Italy. And he came from a family out of town that made instruments, violins and cellos and violas. That's what they did to this day. He grew up to be a violin and cello maker, and he specced his wood from Scandinavia. He specced spruce trees. And the trees that grew during these, all during these 2 centuries, their rings hardly showed. In other words, they had almost no growth rings. They had them, but they weren't really growing during the winter because they were surviving, but they weren't growing. And as you know, those of you who are woodworkers, that kind of grain is gold. It's so beautiful. It's beautiful to look at, it's beautiful to work, but it's also extraordinarily resonant. And Stradivari made these, which are the Stradivarius violins, which are worth $3, $4, $5 million today because of their sound, extraordinary sound. And so what I want to close with is I want you to hear one. And this is Joshua Bell, probably the most eminent American violinist, playing O mio babbino caro, which is a famous Puccini aria. Usually you hear it sung. Sometimes you'll hear it at weddings and so forth. But it's really one of the most beautiful arias ever composed. And this is the Gibson Ex Huberman Stradivarius violin. And what I want you to think about or feel is that forget Puccini, forget aria. This is life. We are life. We are life. It's not out there. And this is our sound. We make sounds too. And when Puccini was asked once, how can you write such beautiful music? And he said, I don't. He said, I hold a pen, right? And God writes the music. And for me, God is life. I don't think of a God. I think of life itself. And its vastness, its mysteriousness, its complexity, its beauty. That to me is God, all right? And to me, what we're talking about in this century, to make it through this century in a way that's civilized and beautiful and extraordinary, is that we have to hold our pen, but we have to let life speak through us. And to do that, we cannot demonize the world, whether it's people, or whether it's carbon, or whether it's governments, or whether it's corporations. It doesn't mean we don't speak truth to power. But we have to ask ourselves this question, because we did it. We did this. Did climate change happen to us, or is it happening for us? Think about it, right? Because if it's happening to us, then we're victims, and we're cut off, and we're separated. From who? We're separated from each other because somebody victimized us, somebody did it to us. But if it's happening for us, we are so empowered. And we see this as a gift, not as a curse, to reimagine the world. Every single aspect of it. Because climate change is the transformation that transforms everything. Everything. Nothing will be the same except deeply held human values and sensibilities that come from being alive, you know? And I just want to leave you with this idea that the solutions that reside in life, that reside in nature, surpass everything that we think is possible. And they're there. They're right there. We've just begun to scratch the surface. And so climate change, you can see it as like, why was I born now? Why me? You know, or you can see it, this is such an extraordinary time to be alive. Couldn't be a more interesting time, a more innovative time, a time in which humanity will either learn, as does carbon know, to hold hands and collaborate, or it'll be the end of civilization, for sure. Because the only civilized thing we can do is come together. And it will wipe out in the artifices of difference, whether it be race, boundary, sexuality, gender, religion, all that stuff is meaningless. Absolutely meaningless in terms of our connectivity to each other. You know? And that's really what climate change is saying to us, is that life wants to speak through us. So let it. It's fun. It's beautiful. Thanks so much.
As you're aware, climate talk in Alberta is oil sands, tar sands, and pipeline talk. And pipeline talk.
Right.
And I just wonder if, from the perspective you've elucidated, what might follow for our struggle here with issues of resource extraction and getting that resource out to the world. The things we usually talk about here when we talk about climate.
Yeah, we were talking earlier today about this sense that I spoke about not seeing companies or people as other. In other words, they're not other, they're us. This idea of self is an illusion. And at the same time, you see things which are extraordinarily absurd, which is tar sands. And I think it's absurd for many reasons, but the most absurd reason is that there's such a low yield of energy from it. It's the highest amount of carbon you could expend for the least amount of energy. So it actually isn't even economical, and the only reason it's economical is because the natural gas is so cheap to heat up the tar to extract the oil from. And if it wasn't true, then the thing would collapse of its own weight. And seeing the world in an integrated way does not mean you don't speak truth to power. It doesn't mean you don't clearly, courageously address it. It just means you don't demonize it. They're not the evil, it's not enemy, it's just other, in the sense it's somebody else, it's some other group, it's some company, but it's still, you have to own it. You know, did anybody drive here? Did anybody fly here? Did anybody use fossil fuels today in the room? I mean, so we have to be, in a sense, gentle too, and realize that we have to make a transition. And the question is, how do we make that transition? Do we make it in an intelligent way, or do we make it in a way that's really run by money? And the tar sands, to me, is a perfect example of something that makes no sense at all in terms of energetics. We spoke earlier today about ERVOI, energy return on energy invested, and as you know, for every barrel of oil, every 2.5 barrels of oil you get out of the tar sands, it takes a whole barrel of oil invested in it. In other words, the return is 2.5 to 1. There is no lower return on energy in the world except corn ethanol, which it takes a barrel of oil to get a barrel of oil out. In other words, there's no net energy from corn ethanol. It's just a government subsidy Ponzi scheme with itself. And, but the tar sands is 2.5 to 1, which is just extraordinary when you think we came from 100 to 1 world. We're in a 17 to 1 world now with oil, 40 to 1, 50 to 1 sometimes with coal. Solar, with all due respect, I'm in solar, which is why I'm in solar, is 5 to 1 on a good day. It's not very good. It's not very good. And this is important because the so-called hunting-gathering societies were 10 to 1 societies. For every unit of energy they expended, they got 10 units back of energy, calories, wood, fiber, whatever it was that they needed, and they have the rest of that energy to play, to dance, to do ritual, to make things, to make beautiful headdresses, costumes, to do ritual. Surplus energy is the mother's milk of civilization. And the tar sands has no surplus energy to speak of in terms of a civilization. And that's, forget the fact that it's carbon from it, put it aside, And so the tar sands is just extraordinary. I don't know how it came to be. We have tar sands where we are, and we don't do it because it doesn't pencil out. I don't know why it pencils out up north, but it doesn't down south in the United States. So I think you should do everything you can about it, but at the same time to recognize, as I said earlier, has so much momentum. Statoil there, Shell's there. I mean, everybody's in there now. Companies that are huge. I talked to BP once, and I asked them, I said, what does it feel like to be the second biggest oil company in the world? And they said, we wish. And I said, what do you mean? He said, we're 17th biggest in the world. He said, Exxon is 16, the other 15 are state-owned or private. That's what's running the world. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to try and merge 4 questions together here. So someone in the audience commented that for the most part tonight you're preaching to the choir. There's some challenges engaging people in the changes that are needed. Why, for example, don't companies have the resources or expertise that they need in order to make a change? Why aren't we hearing about things in the media? How can we really get corporations and others to change their ways?
I love preaching to the choir because what I've noticed in the last 20 years, the choir is getting bigger. The questions about how to change corporations and resources, there isn't one way. I've worked with corporations, the largest company in the world and many others. I've worked with states, that is national governments, and they're all different. And how they come about to that point of wanting to change, of being sustainable, if they can at all, is very different. It's different according to culture, country, the industry, the CEO, the owners. It's just all over the map. And so there is no one answer for that question. As I said earlier today, the biggest driver I've ever seen in changing CEO behavior is their daughters coming home from college and saying, Dad, what are you doing? And they've studied their dad's company and came back and said, oh my God, my father's running this company. And so that has been the biggest influence on CEOs anecdotally, but in terms of overall, you've seen, since the Ecology of Commerce was written, which isn't for sale tonight, but since that was written, there's been a wholesale change in the literacy of corporations worldwide. I mean, it's absolutely changed. When Ecology of Commerce was written, the prior 2 books were reviewed over 200 times by business publications, The Next Economy and Growing a Business, and Ecology of Commerce came out. Not one single business publication in the United States would review it. reviews were written, they were killed by editors. And business hated the book. Environmentalists hated the book too, because I was saying business could do extraordinary things too to change the world. And now that has all changed, and even Walmart sells the College of Commerce on their page 1 for their 1.8 million associates. So that is why I'm writing a new book, because I think if that book is acceptable to Walmart, I've got to go even further. But but I would say that what's stopping corporations from changing really is the fact that they don't have any owners. There's no one there. And that the imperatives are growth, the imperatives are bottom line, the imperatives are analysts. And then that goes back to us, because there are pension funds that they're basically trying to make good on. And so we have, again, this cycle. We think we don't have responsibility, but we do. And so where we place our money, I mean, it's, look at it, it's 9:30. Do you know where your money is tonight, really? I mean, honestly, you do not. You do not. I'll tell you where it isn't. It's not in your bank. It's not. When you buy insurance, do you know what they do with that money? You don't. So we, as a people, are giving our money away, in a sense, lending it. Take my money, hold it. People will. And they do exactly what they want to do. It's not what you would want. And one of the things that's coming out of the sharing economy is a whole bunch of ideas to change currency. Ripple is one amazing. Bitcoin, you saw the article yesterday. Not just not just local exchange systems, but changing currency as a whole to get it out of the hands of the holders of currency and large amounts of money. You're seeing, like eye insurance, you're seeing people, insurance collectives where the money belongs to you. It's a real mutual insurance company, not a fake one, where it's your money. And if your house doesn't burn down, you don't have a total of your car, money starts to pile up, So you're incentivized. So, that is going to have the biggest effect on corporations, is to withdraw capital from the way they perform. And we've got to figure out, we've got to ask this question, because what we're told is we can't live without economic growth. If without economic growth, we're cooked. And we start have to asking the question is, how is it that we're going to live with economic growth? Because the system itself is drawing down, different use of the word, every resource in the world, from water to soil to fiber to the oceans to minerals. It's all being drawn down, and taken away, and not to be replaced or replenished. And so I'm not answering that question very well, but I will say that you also see generational changes in corporations, where you see a new generation come in, of leadership and of alertness and literacy, and then everything changes. But the best thing that's happening in business is new companies that don't have this legacy and start afresh. Yes?
How do you remain so hopeful? How do you keep up the positivity in the face of all the trouble and crisis you've witnessed? What advice do you have for us to stay positive as a young scientist, as people in environmental work?
Well, actually, I'm not hopeful. You said, wait. What I mean by that is, in my practice, hope is a curse. It's a mental narcotic to mask fear. You can't have hope unless you're afraid of something. Think about it. They go together like this. And what we need to be in this century is fearless, not hopeful. Fearless means, let's go. I'm going to do it. Got nothing to be afraid of. What is there to be afraid of? But when you're hopeful, your hopes can be dashed, right? And your hopes go up and down, and you read something, you see something, you go, oh my God, I'm losing hope. And then something happens and I'm gaining hope. It's like watching a sports team, they go up and down and up and down. And we do the same thing with these issues. And I'm saying, get rid of hope. Forget about it. I know it sounds sort of radical. There's a book called Radical Hope by Jonathan Lear. It's a really beautiful book, and it's about the Crow people. And the Crow people in the United States were allies with the cavalry, with the army, and because they had a common enemy, the Sioux. And so they said, hey, we're going to help the U.S. Army, and and what that got them was they were wiped out from the reservation. They were put on, that wasn't a reservation, their native land, excuse me, they were put on a small reservation on which they couldn't hunt, and they didn't know how to farm. And from being, Plenty Coup, their chief, and being extraordinary culture, they were just wiped out. And it's really, really an interesting story about what happened, because the woman he quoted this book, said at that time, he said that we, the Crow, are trying to live a life that we don't understand. And in a sense, that's what's going to happen to us. As climate change and the results of it become more pronounced, we're going to be hard-pressed to find a story that makes sense, because no one has control over the effects of climate. And what happened is the Crow lost the concepts with which they could create a meaningful narrative about their life. And I feel like the same thing is going to happen, that we're going to be pressed for that conceptual basis for a narrative that makes sense in this century. And what, in the author's term, what made hope radical for them was that they placed their faith in, and they directed themselves towards a future goodness that transcended their ability to understand what that goodness could be. And that's exactly what we have to do. We have to understand that there's a future goodness in us and in those we don't know. The chief of the Crow, his name was Plenty Coup, and he was called Plenty Coup because he took a lot of coup. I mean, he was one of those legendary warriors that seemed like he had a shield around him and could do anything without being injured or killed. But obviously, he was reduced, like everyone else, to this little reservation. And what he did was he went into the forest. His people looked to him and said, what are we going to do? And he went into the forest and listened. And a chickadee came to him. And something happened between him and the chickadee. And he came back to his people and said, we have to listen to the littlest things and take our cues and our lessons and our teachings from the littlest things in life and in nature. And that's how the Crows survive. And I feel that that is also telling for us too, because I'm not trying to be Panglossian and say it's going to be all fun and games in this century. It's going to be extraordinarily difficult. We're going to be pressed in every way we can be. And at the same time, the reason I am positive is because of you. Because I, in my work, get to meet lots of people. And I have said, if you look at the data and you're not pessimistic, you don't understand the data. But if you meet the people and you look at the people and you're not optimistic, you don't have a pulse. So what do you choose? I choose the people. Yeah.
Okay. We had a couple of people in the audience thinking about greed.
Greed or greed?
Greed.
Oh, yeah.
And wondering if greed is human nature and how we overcome the issue of power and greed to allow all the inventions and ideas that you shared with us to flourish.
It's a really good question. I call those Wizard of Oz questions. If I could answer that question. you can't. You can only overcome it in yourself. You can't do anything about other people's power, hungriness. You can't do anything about other people's greed. There's nothing you can do. But you can look at it and see it in yourself. And usually if it bothers you a lot, it means there's something in you that you're not really looking at. And we change people by changing who we are. We don't change people by trying to change people. When's the last time you appreciated when somebody tried to change you? Right? It's not welcome. But we love to be inspired. We love to be around people who actually, in a sense, challenge us. They don't challenge us directly, but they challenge us because we perceive something in them that we hadn't seen before, that we like, that we aspire to, that makes us think, that makes us wonder, that makes us curious. And those people are the pivot points by which we change. We're like sailors at sea looking at stars, and we go from star to star. Those stars are you. They're you. It's how you know this is true. You know this is how you've changed. And we will continue to. And so, but there will always be a part of humanity. It's the human condition, and it's what we've got to work with. You know, it makes it, listen, if this was easy, it wouldn't be fun. It's not going to be easy.
Paul, there's a few people here who are interested in your book about solutions, the one that included programs, technologies, ideas,
Right.
that type of thing. Some interest in the format. Are you sharing that? Is it going to be a printed copy? Is it going to be something that people contribute to online, sort of like a Wikipedia? Maybe a bit more about your ideas on that.
Drawdown is .org. You can write to Paul at drawdown.org or .com, either one, and .net. Not .com, .net and .org, excuse me. And I'll get the email and I'll respond. That's number one. Number two, it will be printed every year. The reason it'll be printed every year is because the website is live. And so the information will be updated every year in terms of the metrics, the numbers, the dashboard. And generally speaking, an NGO, an academic department, an institute owns a spread. They own that spread. And so it's their job to update it, to factually make sure it's current and correct. And that means that every year we can publish a new edition. We will add things like some of the technologies I mentioned as they become state of the shelf. And we may amend things because people like Wikipedia will come in and say, you know, I question those assumptions. Everything will be transparent. There'll be no, on the dashboard or any other part that won't be, where we use all our sources in a transparency, IEC, IPCC, whatever institution the data are derived from or come from. We have 25 advisors. We're looking for really great people to be advisors, to be, in a sense, review it. We have the Parliamentary Commission of New Zealand. We have the Governor of Maryland. We have some interesting people. We want more. We want a university that wants to own one of those spreads or propose one. We look for ideas. Like I say, we want this book to be really we, not so it's something that nobody, the deniers, cannot say, oh, well, that's your idea. No, it's not my idea at all. My idea was to put it together. It's like a mirror and reflecting back to us all what it is that we know at the state and to update it constantly so that it becomes useful and doesn't become dated. It's going to be a website, and on the website we also have, it can be used as a game, not a game so much as an assignment, something in between, so that you can take a 9th grade class and say, okay, you have $1 trillion, you have 10 years, come back tomorrow, who can do the most in terms of mitigation? That is not so easy as it sounds when you look at the dashboard. All the data is there, but you have 4 variables, and that's some algorithm, I'll tell you. And because you have time, and you have first costs, and you have rate of mitigation, and you have net savings or net costs, and you put them all together, and you're going to get a whole bunch of different answers, which is great, which means that whether they're 9th graders or 12th graders or whether they're in college or whatever, then they have to really know the data. They have to go in. And we don't want to have a calculator on the website where you can just find out, because that would actually nullify the whole point of it, which is for people to get in the data and really understand how it works together and so forth. So it also means about sequencing. What would you do first and second and third and fourth? And so that's how it's going to be constructed. So it's drawdown.org, or it's in an email at drawdown.org, drawdown.net. But Paul will go to me. So thanks. Thank you so much. Thank you.